Okay. Thanks, everyone. I want to start by acknowledging the co-authors that are listed on this first slide here. This is a big collaborative project, and there's a lot of teamwork that happens. So I just want to point out that this isn't really my presentation, everyone's presentation. And the other thing that I wanted to make sure I highlight is that this is a work in progress. And so data collection is still underway, and I'm going to just be presenting some very preliminary results today. So as most of you probably know, there is an increased interest in the use of drones in all different sectors, from recreation and professional photography, but also for research and other applications involving wildlife, including different types of monitoring, sampling, and documentation of animals. There's many applications, many benefits, and many risks, and I'm going to talk through some of those here in the intro. So some of the applications of using drones for wildlife include detecting animals, finding out if they're even in an area, monitoring entire populations or individuals, or tracking those individuals, surveilling for poachers, and oil spill response, just to name a few. There's many benefits to drones over other methods of surveying and monitoring wildlife, including providing that unique aerial perspective. It can improve efficiency by covering a large area over a short period of time. It can improve human safety if it means removing humans from airplanes to conduct that similar research. And it also allows you to get different types of images and photos in regular color, like in color, the RGB spectrum, or infrared options. However, as all of you are probably also aware, there's a lot of risks and limitations to using drones as well. Number one, probably of most interest to this group, is the harm that they can cause to wildlife, and that can manifest in terms of disturbance in terms of behavioral changes, site or nest abandonment, reproductive disruption, stress to the animals, or even injury. There's also some limitations of using drones, including battery life and needing to keep the drone in line of sight. So you can't really send it very far away from where you're standing or based. The impetus for the research that I'm presenting today, part of that was the idea of using drones during oil spills. They've already been used during some spills to survey the actual area where the product is impacting. They've been used to survey for oiled and unoiled, but potentially might become oiled wildlife. And they've been used to haze wildlife, so to intentionally disturb them, to get them out of an area before the oil hits. The particular application to this study, specifically focusing on sea otters, is because we know that sea otters are vulnerable to oiling for a number of reasons that I'm not going to go into, but you can ask me later if you have questions about that. And we also know that they're vulnerable to disturbance, as has been presented at a couple previous disturbance symposiums. And there's going to be interest in if there is a spill involving sea otters, there is going to be interest in using drones to survey for sea otters. And because we know they're vulnerable to disturbance, we wanted to understand better what disturbance might look like and how it can be minimized. So our overall study has 4 primary objectives, which are listed here on the screen. But because of time constraints, I'm only going to be talking about our first objective, which is determining sea otter reactions to drones. Now, I think most of us would probably assume that sea otters do react to drones and they can cause a disturbance, but we found that there's not any published literature on that. And so it was really important for us to scientifically document what those reactions are, rather than just saying that we think that there are reactions occurring. So our study has 3 locations that are shown here on the map. Our general study location is the Monterey Peninsula, which is shown with the red star here on the smaller white map in the upper right corner. And our 3 locations are Cannery Row in Monterey, which is indicated by the blue star. And this area has a high level of background disturbance from kayakers and other disturbance sources. The next site is Otter Point in Pacific Grove, which is indicated by the green star. And this site has a medium level of background disturbance. And our third site was Fanshell Beach in Pebble Beach, which is indicated by the orange star here and has a low level of background disturbance. And I'm showing these sites for reference, but I'm not going to go into the different comparisons between the sites in this talk because we're still conducting that analysis. To collect our data, we conducted focal follows on sea otters, and we started with a baseline observation for 20 minutes where we're collecting behavioral data with no drones present. And then we subsequently did 3 drone flights over that same focal otter. And for every minute during those focal follows, we recorded the average and the maximum behavior for every minute. And I've got our behavior codes listed here, and they're kind of ranked from the least kind of alert and disturbed to the most alert and disturbed. And I want to point out that as part of our data collection protocol, we aren't making the determination of whether the sea otter is reacting to the drone. We are just describing what the behavior is that we're observing, because as most of you guys know who have done behavioral work with animals, it's very hard to say specifically what an animal is reacting to or if they're reacting to a specific stimuli, because there could be other things in the environment that we can or cannot see that that might be causing them to change their behavior. So for this study, we're just documenting what the behavior is, not making the judgment ourselves on what whether the reaction is because of the drone. We're going to let the data tell us that. So for the 3 drone flights, we used the same drone profile where we'd launch the drone to 200 feet, fly it out to over the focal otter, and then drop down in 10-foot increments for 1 minute at a time, and then come back up in 10-foot increments as well, and then come back to land the drone at the launch site. Now, our launch and landing locations were chosen to minimize disturbance to nearby black oyster catchers. The analyses that I'm going to be presenting today are the results of a linear fixed effects model that compares the average maximum behavior code that we observed for baseline versus the first drone flight. So as I mentioned, we did 3 consecutive drone flights, but for this analysis or for this presentation, I'm just comparing baseline versus the first drone flight. So far, we've conducted over 25 survey days between 2020 and 2022, and we've amassed hundreds of images and videos to our photo and video library, including images of single otters, groups of otters, otters in kelp, in open water, and images with other wildlife and kayaks and lots of other things. So that's going to be really helpful for some of the other components of our project, as well as just having great videos and photos to share with you during presentations. So next I'm going to show you 2 different videos to show you some of the differences between our traditional sea otter observation method, where we're looking from ground level, either through a spotting scope or through a zoom lens to observe sea otters, versus the drone perspective. So the first video is the one on the left, and that is going to show you the standard horizontal perspective. And what I want you to keep an eye on is these 2 animals on the left-hand side. The more blonde furred one was our focal animal for this trial. So you can see that the non-focal animal is looking up quite a bit. The drone is directly overhead. It was at 60 feet during this video, whereas you can see that the focal animal is pretty much just resting and kind of oblivious. I also want you to notice that there's a harbor seal in the foreground that looks pretty close by, and there's a group of otters in the background that also looks pretty close by and may or may not be reacting to the drone. I want you to notice the relative perspective of each of those. And also now we've got a kayak passing by, which also looks pretty close, but again, not appearing to be of interest to the focal animal. Next, I'm going to show you the drone perspective. This is the exact same 45-second clip focusing on, the drone was right over the focal animal, that blonde animal. So you can again see that We've got the younger, darker-headed animal. It's a little bit harder to see that it's looking up at the drone. It's a little harder to see exactly what it's doing, but you can pretty much see that the focal animal is resting. It doesn't appear to be reacting. Now, I want you to notice that we're not seeing the harbor seal or the other group of otters in this video, and that's because the previous view, the image kind of gets compressed when you're looking horizontally through a spotting scope or zoomed in. So it really can change your perspective and make things look much closer than they appear. You also don't see the kayaks passing by, so they were actually a lot farther away than they appeared. So I hope that gives you an idea of kind of the different perspective and that the drone can provide, and also show that you have, like with our data, we're recording data on the focal animal, but the other animals around could be reacting differently and exhibiting different behaviors. So we're just providing us able to capture kind of a snapshot of what's happening with our focal animals. So the main data or the main finding that I want to share with you today, which again is preliminary, is that there does seem to be a detectable difference in behavior between the baseline when the drone was not present and during when the drone was present during the first drone flight. So this figure shows the average maximum behavior score on the y-axis, and I've got the behavior codes listed here to remind you on the left. And the average behavior code was a higher score when the drone was present. So it was up here between passive scanning and active scanning when the drone was present, and compared to baseline where it was closer to passive grooming. And that difference was highly statistically significant with a p-value of less than 0.0001. And there's a lot more analyses that we're going to conduct, but that's kind of the most obvious and very important one that I wanted to share with you today. Now, there's a lot of limitations and caveats and considerations to consider with our findings and with our study. So our study is only using one drone type. It's a small quadcopter and only one flight profile. And we're only looking at otters in one general location. So it would be important in the future to extrapolate this to more different sites with more different types of drones and flight profiles. There's also a lot of variables that are out of our control with this study, like kayakers paddling into the group of otters that we're observing, and some of those are challenging to see or even document. And also we've noticed that our focal follows tend to be biased towards older animals because those animals tend to be easier to identify and keep track of. And we've noticed anecdotally that the younger animals that may not be the focals seem a bit more reactive and alert during the drone trials. In general, things to consider when we're thinking about using drones to an oil spill response or other monitoring or research applications, it requires, the weather needs to be pretty good, so low wind and not a lot of fog in order to fly the drone, and also in order to be able to see it and keep it in line of sight. Glare and other challenging lighting conditions can really diminish the usefulness of the photos and the video and make it hard to find animals. We recognize that oiled animals may react differently than the animals, the healthy unoiled animals that we are documenting with this study. And there's other species that may be in the area that may be sensitive to the drone that you have to consider. And I will share that we've had some pretty severe reactions of gulls towards the drone, and we've had to stop doing our study in one of the locations for extended periods of time because the gulls were so agitated. So next steps are, as I mentioned, this is a work in progress. We're still collecting data, so we'll continue to collect data, and then we'll do a lot more data analysis to answer more questions. We hope to create a best practices guidelines for drone operators operating around sea otters based on our findings, and including a minimum altitude that it's safe to operate drones around sea otters while minimizing the risk of disturbance. And we're hoping to create an auto detection program that will allow you to identify sea otters on the screen in real time. Future studies should include drones of different sizes and types at more locations, including additional species with different profiles, and also may want to account for the sound, the noise that the drone makes, in addition to the visual presence that the drone has that animals may be reacting to. That's not something we've really been able to measure for this study. And lastly, I'd just like to acknowledge the folks that weren't listed on the first slide, on the opening slide, including our drone pilots, some wonderful assistants that we've had this year helping with data collection and observations, and our funding source, which is the Oiled Wildlife Care Network at UC Davis. So with that, I will be happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Colleen. I know we have some questions in the chat. Alex Fairfield is asked, saying, great study, 2 questions. How much time in between the 3 drone flights? And question 2, did animals behave more or less to subsequent drone flights 2 and 3? Good question.
So the time between the drone flights were however much time it took the pilot to change the batteries and the observers to give their necks a break from looking through the scopes. So it's pretty quick, you know, sometimes like only 5 to 10 minutes. And in terms of the subsequent reactions, that's an analysis that we haven't done yet, but it is on our list of things that we're going to look at.
Amanda says, this research project has been exemplary for coordinating with the local folks monitoring the black oyster catchers and even respecting nesting goals. It's a perfect example of how to team up with all local groups to reduce disturbance to other sensitive coastal species. Thank you to all the researchers involved.
Thanks,
we have a raised hand from Katie.
Yeah, hi. I was wondering, I guess because we have several people in the chat, like Amanda, who are working on multiple, like there seems to be multiple projects in terms of like drone monitoring and things like that. Has anyone thought of making a database for especially stuff like how high the drones need to be for different species? I know that with the local gulls, the Huermans tend to be a little bit less affected, but the Westerns tend to be more affected.
Yeah, so there's definitely a couple of different levels of collaboration. There was a drone meeting among Monterey Bay drone operators and wildlife interest groups a couple of years ago, and I know there was a Slack channel that was created to continue those conversations. Separately, our department has a drone working group, and as part of that, we're compiling a database based on published literature that have information about wildlife disturbance from drones and kind of best practices. So I don't know that there is a central repository for exactly what you just described, but I think we're kind of working in that direction. And there, you know, we try to just maximize collaboration and information sharing among the agencies so that whatever information is available can be shared. And for this study, we're absolutely planning on publishing our findings so that it's available to anyone.
Sweet, thank you.
There you go. Karen says, great work. Color, black versus white, and size of drones in addition to sound also appears to have different effects. Paul says, I use low noise propellers that can't be heard above the sound of the surf. And Diana wonders about the aerial predation predisposition in otters versus other species and the lack of habituation to disturbance by younger animals versus older experienced animals. Very interesting study and collaborative work.
Yeah, I just want to comment on this, the second comment there about less habituation in younger animals. I think that's definitely possible, that they are just, less habituated to all sorts of different stimuli, disturbance stimuli, so that they could be more reactive. And it's something that we would like to have a better understanding of. So we do record the age, relative approximate age and sex when we can of all of our focal animals, and we're trying to get as balanced of a sample as we can. But as it's challenging to monitor and follow those younger animals because they tend to be less distinguishable, and therefore if they are moving around a lot within the group or they dive, it's very hard to know for sure that you are monitoring the same animal or finding the same animal, recording data on that animal. To really know what the reactions are. So, a follow-up study might include tagged animals, or more of like a scan sampling approach where you're documenting reactions of an entire group of animals rather than a single individual at a time.
Yeah, and I'd just like to follow up on what Colleen just mentioned. There's probably a personality component. So sea otters have individual personalities, and some of them seem to be more generally stoic than others. And we might have a slight bias. We pick an animal straight off the bat, we might end up with a slight bias towards otters that are staying put rather than ones that are disappearing because we lose those. So yeah, being able to carry this out with tagged otters that we know we could reliably. Every now and then we get a tagged otter as a focal otter and we're super excited. But usually we're just trying to hold a visual over a long period of time, and that's pretty challenging. I think we have a comment from Karen.
Yeah, Karen says 2019 had a UAS drone summit at Mbari, and there were a lot of different resources covered from many groups. There may be notes that can be shared listing those resources. Thank you, Karen. That's a great tip. And then Diana says Slack channel and database sounds like a great idea.
And we have one more question from Robin.
I just wanted to say, Paul is our drone operator for the Sierra Club Seal Society, and we use him to do surveys for us for counts of pups and throughout the pupping season when the area is closed, because those sea lions like to hide under the cliffs where we can't see them. And that's the only way to get a view of where they're located. And as he pointed out, he does use a specific kind of low noise drone, and it's quite noisy there because we have big surf, so you can't hear it. But my question is, though, for other recreational, he has a commercial license, but for other recreational users that do come down, is there a general guideline we can suggest to the city or to the people as docents to keep a certain distance above the sea lions?
So we are hoping to come up with a best practices guidelines document as a result of this study that could be used by recreational drone users or people that are applying for research permits or commercial filming permits. But I would suspect that the reactions to sea lions hauled out on land could be pretty different than sea otters. So I would suggest trying to find data on a more similar species that, like harbor seals and other species that are hauled out, other pinnipeds that are hauled out, or do conduct a study. One thing we did before we realized we really need a specific study to answer this question is anytime someone applied for a drone permit, we worked with the folks at the agencies that were issuing that permit and asked if we could be there to observe, to record data, because we didn't have our own drone, we didn't have a project at that time, and so we got some initial data while other people were operating drones around sea otters based on what we told them we thought would be a safe height, and then we went there and recorded data that we're able to say to collect data on whether there was disturbance. And that's what informed our initial drone profile, starting at 150 feet and dropping down to 60 feet. We thought that was going to be the area that where we knew the most. We thought above 150 feet, there probably wouldn't be as much risk of disturbance, especially to sea otters in the area where we were doing our study. We thought below 60 feet, there was a very high probability for disturbance. And so that's where that range came from, where we're really trying to narrow it in a little bit more.